Hi guys, this is Abby from Witchcraft Criminal History. How you doing today? Hopefully you're doing well. Happy Easter. Well, today we are doing a video on Bonnie and Clyde. This is the Easter special. So hopefully you guys are going to enjoy this video on Bonnie and Clyde. Alright. Bonnie Parker was born Bonnie Elizabeth Parker. She was born on the 1st of October 1910 in Rowena, Texas, which was just south of Abilene, Texas. She was the second child out of 3 children, so she was the middle child. Her father, Charles Robert Parker, was a bricklayer who unfortunately passed away when Bonnie was only 4 years of age. She was raised by her mother, who, became a widow. Her name was Emma Parker, and she, right after her husband passed away, she picked up her family and moved from Rowena, Texas, to Cement City, which is an industrial suburb of West Dallas. And, she worked as a seamstress. Bonnie was the type of person who liked, writing poetry. She loved writing, so she was quite literate. And she wrote some poetry such as the story of Suicide Sale, the Trails End, and the story of Bonnie and Clyde. During her high school years, Bonnie met Roy Fortin. They dropped out of high school and they married on the 25th of September 1926. Roy Fortin was a petty criminal, and he was done for robbery and was sentenced to jail. And while he was in prison, Bonnie Parker met Clyde Barrow. And when after she met Clyde Barrow, she never saw her husband ever again. And she worked from time to time when she was with Clyde Barrow. And prior to meeting Clyde Barrow, she was, working as a waitress. And she was actually doing a lot of waitressing, and she was doing a lot of waitressing work. And where she was working, she was actually working majority of the times on and off serving police officers. And some of these police officers, they not only knew her, they actually, had to take her down, at the end of Bonnie Parker's life, which, which is kind of, kind of shocking in some ways. And in, legal terms, really, because they knew Bonnie Parker, they knew her prior to her, running off with Clyde Barrow. They, knew her. They knew Bonnie, who, was trying to make ends meet. So, really, they wouldn't really, be suited for to solve this crime, because the simple fact is, they had connections. Clyde Barrow was born Clyde Chestnut Barrow, and he was born on March 24th, or 24th of March. He came from a very poor family in Ellis County in Texas, which was near Telco, which apparently is just southeast of Dallas. He was the 5th child to be born out of 7 children. So he was one of the mid-children. His parents were Henry Basil Barrow and Kumi Talitha Walker. And they migrated to Dallas in the 1920s. And I think by that time the family was a bit split because of the poor environment All the younger children were with them in Ellis. And when they were to Dallas, the older children were already in Dallas. I'm not quite sure whether Clyde Barrow was, considered one of the older ones, he was a mid-child, or did he came later? I got a funny feeling he actually came later. He migrated to Dallas with his family. And when they were there in Dallas, Texas, his family was running a fuel station or a service station, to make ends meet, and things were really tough for the Barrows. They were poor to begin with, and when the Great Depression came around, because this is during the Great Depression, that because the Great Depression, money was tight, and if you were poor, just like the Barrows, it was hard to make ends meet. It was really, really hard. And it was really, really hard to go on, especially when you got 7 mouths to feed. With 7 children, that's not to mention about the parents themselves. And Clyde Barrow, when he was a little bit older, when he was 17, he was arrested when he was 17 in 1926, because he ran away from the police after he failed to return a rental car, and he and his brother were caught with they were caught having a possession of stolen goods. And even though they had legitimate, when it was around 1926, 1927, he and his brother got arrested. They got arrested a couple of times, and his brother's name was Buck. Buck Barrow, but it was also, his real name was Malvern Barrow, but his family and friends called him Buck. And after the arrests in 1928 and 1929, when Clyde Barrow was 21 years of age, he was sent to Eastham prison farm in April of 1930. So in 1930 he went to jail. And to say the least, this prison had a very bad reputation at the time. It was one of the worst prisons you could ever go to, is Eastham Prison Farm. It was the worst. Apparently the guards would, beat and torture the prisoners, because back in those days, apparently that happened quite a lot. If you were a prisoner, you kind of got beat on. And apparently Clyde Barrow was being sexually assaulted as well by another inmate. This inmate was found murdered in the bathroom of Eastham Prison Farm. A convicted murderer who was there took the blame for it. Took the blame for the murder because he was already sentenced to death at the particular time. And even though he wasn't the one who killed him, it was Clyde Barrow. And a fellow inmate by the name of Ralph Fultz said that there was a physical change with Clyde Barrow. He came into the Eastham Prison Farm as a schoolboy, and when he came out, he was a rattlesnake. And that he became dangerous. And the sad thing was, things got so bad at this prison that Clyde Barrow actually mutilated 2 of his toes. He actually chopped 2 of his toes off. And the sad thing with this is that soon after he lost his toes, after self-inflicted injury, he was actually released on parole, so really he didn't need to chop his toes off. But he did it, he didn't want to be there. And considering what was going on there, I don't blame him. I don't blame Clyde Barrow. But by the time Clyde Barrow left Eastham prison farm, he was already a murderer. Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow met on the 5th of January 1930 at Clyde Barrow's best friend's house, Clarence Clay. This was on Herbert Street, and this was also in West Dallas. At that particular time, she was 19 and Clyde Barrow was 20 years of age. And there was quite a few times, Bonnie Parker, spent time with the Barrows and became quite close with the Barrow family. And the Barrow family themselves were actually very, very close-knit family. They were very close. They loved each other. They would do anything for each other. And it was only Buck and Clyde that, as far as I found out, is they're the only ones who've ever committed any serious crimes. And they certainly weren't the only ones who joined the Barrow gang. And when they got together, according to the papers and according to a lot of people who knew Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow, that they fell madly in love. I've actually read a book about this particular case, and I will talk a little bit more about Clyde Barrow, because there's something really, really interesting about Clyde Barrow. Clyde Barrow got released from that prison in 1932. And as soon as he got released from, prison, he swore he was never, ever, 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 ever going to go back to jail. He was never going back to jail. And I don't think he had any intentions of going straight either. On April 19th, Bonnie Parker and Fultz, they were captured in a failed hardware store burglary in Kaufman, Texas, in which they were attempting to steal some firearms, and subsequently they were jailed for the particular crimes. And while they were in jail, Clyde Barrow was released. And also, want to know a little bit more about this particular era as well. This was also the time we had Pretty Boy Floyd and John Dillinger. So that's type of era we're talking about. On April 30th, Clyde Barrow was the driver in a robbery in Hillsborough, Texas, during which J.N. Butcher was shot and killed. When they were shown, mugshots, the victim's wife identified Clyde Barrow as one of the shooters, even though he was outside in the car. It was the first time that Clyde Barrow was connected or accused of a murder. On August 5th, while Parker was visiting her mother in Dallas, Clyde Barrow, Raymond Hamilton, and Ross Dyer were drinking alcohol at a country dance in Strington, Oklahoma, when the sheriff C.G. Maxwell and his deputy Eugene C. Moore approached them in the parking lot Clyde Barrow and Hamilton, Clyde and Raymond Hamilton, opened fire, killing the deputy and gravely wounding the sheriff. And this was the first time that, the Barrow gang were known to, kill. And they were actually known from then on as the Barrow gang. On October the 11th, they allegedly killed Howard Hall at his home during a robbery in Sherman, Texas. However, historians are not quite sure whether they were responsible for that crime or they were actually innocent. Because there is suspicions of, that there were suspicions that they were innocent. W.D. Jones, or Walter Jones, because I think his name was Walter, they were best friends with, he was best friends with Clyde Barrow since they were children. And he was actually told by Clyde Barrow, no one knows you, go home, don't do it. But W.D. Jones didn't do that and subsequently joined the Barrow gang. And he's persuaded the Barrow gang to leave Dallas. And this was right on, on Christmas Day. Clyde Barrow and the Barrow gang, killed Doyle Johnson, a young man, while stealing a car in Temple, Texas. And 2 weeks later, on January 6, 1933, Barrow killed Tarrant County Deputy Sheriff Malcolm Davis, while they were trying to escape from a police trap, pretty much. An interesting, thing about, this case as well is that Clyde Barrow, in some ways was a very smart man. He knew that pretty much with the police officers in that particular time, they had to supply everything. Nowadays, it's the government who has to supply the police cars, the guns, the training, the whole shebang. However, back in the late 1920s, 1930s, even before that, if you were a sheriff or a policeman, you had to supply everything. You had to supply your cars, you had to supply your guns, you had to supply literally everything. And subsequently, around this time, Ford, produced, they produced one of their most elite vehicles. The car what Clyde always went was Ford V8, and this was the elite car you can get. It was a very, very expensive car, and Clyde Barrow, always went after this car because he knew that the police, like some, policemen at that particular time, they could only afford a bicycle. So just imagine a bicycle trying to get down a Ford V8. They're not going to get much luck, not much luck whatsoever. So, of course, they commit rob a bank, drive off, and they don't even need to put the pedal to the metal if there's a guy on a bicycle, who's a policeman. Because there was, some places where it was that poor that they only had a bicycle. Which is kind of ridiculous. Like, how the hell is a poor policeman on a bicycle supposed to, capture anyone? And, Clyde Barrow, he knew this. He was, well aware of this, of this simple fact. On March 22nd, 1933, Buck Barrow was granted full pardoned, and released from prison. And at this time, he was married to this was his third wife, named Blanche. Blanche Barrow. However, compared to his two previous wives, Buck and Blanche were very, very close. They were madly in love with each other just as much as Bonnie and Clyde. And it was not exactly, a fun time for the Barrow gang when they were on the run. Because they were driving, literally non-stop, going from town to town to town to town to stay one step ahead of the law. Because, they had to do that. Even though most of the times, they have to cross state borders. Nowadays, if you got a time machine and brought the Barrow gang back to, 2019, the Barrow gang would be having a harder time because they would have the FBI on their asses. As soon as they robbed a bank and fled from one state to another state, you would have the FBI on your ass. But back in the 1930s, the FBI, or the Federal Bureau of Investigations, what we know today, did not exist. There was the federal police. However, the federal police only dealt with mail fraud, or dealing with the post. They did not do anything to do with robbery, murder. They didn't do any of that. Like, I don't really know my states, but for example, if you shot someone in Texas and you fled to California, like over there very, very close, if I'm wrong, I apologize, but you go to California, the police couldn't touch you. They could not touch you because you were in another state. It's equivalent, like over here in Australia, if you got shot, if you shot someone in Melbourne and you decided to flee to Sydney, in New South Wales. Same issue. And that was why it was very imperative for the Barrow gang to, primarily steal V8, Ford V8s. Because the Ford V8s were, the state-of-the-art cars, and they were a lot faster. On the 13th of April, a five-man team from the police went to investigate a property because they believed that there was bootleggers, living at this particular apartment. However, it wasn't bootleggers, it was the Barrow gang. And to say the least, the one thing you do not want to do with the Barrow gang is to, hide them, pretty much corner them. You do not want to corner the Barrow gang. And pretty much that's exactly, what happened on the 13th of April. And as a result, there was firefight and Buck Barrow killed Detective McGuinness. And he also fatally wounded Constable Harriman. And, because of this, they were living in this little apartment, they were forced to, flee. And they were so much forced to flee, they left a lot of things behind. Such as photos, things of importance. They left everything and literally, ran for it. And this was happening in Joplin, because they were stationed in Joplin. And, from that day on, they pretty much had to, had to keep going on the road. And what I mean by, leaving everything, For example, Buck and Blanche's marriage certificate, they actually left that behind. So something, of that importance was, left along with a lot of everything else, as I said beforehand. And as a result, they became, a media sensation. Because prior to this, people knew of Bonnie and Clyde, but they couldn't put, put faces for Bonnie and Clyde. So from now on, Bonnie and Clyde, you could say the Romeo and Juliet of crime, of criminals, now had faces. And people who could, can put a face to the name of Bonnie and Clyde. And along with the rest of the Barra gang. And, for 3 months, the Barra gang, they were, on the run. And, they ranged from Texas to far north Minnesota. And in May, at Lucerne, Indiana, they robbed a bank. And they robbed a bank in Oklahoma, Minnesota. Or not Oklahoma, Okabena, Minnesota. And along the way, they've also committed a kidnapping of Dillard Darby and Sophia Stone at Ruston, Louisiana, in the course of stealing the Darby's car. And this was one of the many incidences that will happen in this particular time frame. And, the Dillard and Sophia were, released, they were released from the Barra gang. And the way the Barra gang, acted when they abducted people, which they did now and then, they would, make sure that they're well away from where they were abducted to begin with. However, this is where you got the Robin Hood, side of it. They would always make sure that the person had enough money to get home. So, to say the least, they did have, some form of conscience. And their main issue was to deal with law enforcement. As far as I know, apart from the prisoner in the prison, practically all the killings, what the Barra gang had committed, were done on police. They would not hesitate to kill a lawman if that lawman tracked them down. And it is believed that all members of the Barra gang, including Bonnie Parker, had killed a police officer, sometime, during the run. And, because they would go from state to state and stealing cars along the way. On the 10th of June, while driving, Jones and Parker near Wellington, Texas, they missed some warning signs at a bridge, which was under construction, and as a result, the car actually crashed into a ravine. And they're not quite sure whether because there's rumours that the car actually blew up, but they're not quite sure if that's fact or fiction. And subsequently, because of the accident, Bonnie Parker actually had severe burns, which was done by either by the fire, if it was caused by that, or by acid. And these burns are third-degree burns, and Third-degree burns are one of the worst type of burns you can ever sustain. And her burns, her injuries because of these severe burns, they were so bad that they weren't quite sure whether Bonnie Parker was actually going to survive it. Because when you got a third-degree burns, like you got 3 different burns, you got first degree, second degree, and third degree. First degree is usually redness. If you got like redness, like you guys got like sunburn, that's first degree burn. Second degree burn is where there's the epidermis, where the blisters are formed. That's a second degree burn. A third degree burn is a burn that goes right through the skin layers, like right down to the muscle. And there's also another one which is beyond that, which is a fourth degree burn, where it literally burns right down to the bone. But third degree and fourth degree are very, very severe burns, and this was on her leg, and this would have been a very, very nasty burn. She would have been open for infections, and I don't exactly blame them for believing that she might not make it. And Clyde Barrow actually, carried Bonnie Parker, to somewhere where they could get help. And they actually went to a local farm. And, for a while they hid in a tourist court near Fort Smith in Kansas. While they were nursing, Bonnie Parker, back to health. And during this time, also, while she was recovering, Buck Barrow and Jones, they went out to commit a robbery. They bungled it, means they stuffed it. And as a result, they killed Town Marshal Henry D. Humphrey in Alma, Kansas. And as a result, they were being pursued again, even though Bonnie Parker was was still, gravely ill. In July 1933, the Barrow gang checked into at the Red Crown Tourist Court, south of Platte City in Missouri, which apparently now is within the city limits of Kansas City in Missouri. And this place consisted of 2 brick cabins, joined by a garage. And apparently while they were in this particular location, Blanche Barrow actually had held, a few parties. Even though they actually, were paying for it, Blanche paid for it, with coins. And she also paid for meals with coins. And apparently they, went, pretty much had a free time pretty much, because they went around, buying, necessities like bandages, cheese, atropine sulfate. But as a result, all this was going to the cops. Well, the information was. And as a result, because the law enforcement were notified, from Kansas City included, and the police actually had an armored car. And back in those days, armored cars were very, very easily to pick out. If a car was armored, because they couldn't bend the glass back in those days. So, if you ever go to old museums of, crime museums, you can always tell, they tell which ones have been, which were bulletproof, because they kind of stick out like a sore thumb, because they would have very flat windscreen. And at 11 p.m., the Sheriff Coffey, led a group of police officers to the Thompson submachine guns and headed towards the cabins. And apparently when they got there, they started, once again having a bit of a gunfight. However, the police, as I said earlier in this video, they could not, outgun, the Barra gang, because once again, the Barra gang, had, the best of the best weapons, and they actually, robbed, robbed places which had good guns, like military type of guns. As the poor law enforcement, they didn't have that. And, like Clyde Barra's favourite weapon was a Browning automatic rifle. They were also known as a BAR, which, just like the rest of them, they were stolen. And this one was apparently stolen on the 7th of July from a National Guard armory in Enid, Oklahoma. So they would literally go to armories just to sell, just to pinch the guns. As the, the gunfire went on, the Barra gang, once again, fled. And the police did not, pursue them. However, not all the Barra gang, fled. It was predominantly Bonnie and Clyde, as Buck Barrow had sustained a very, very, mortal head wound. And Blanche, from the gunfight, became blind in one eye through the glass, going into her eye. And Buck Barrow, later on, passed away from his injury. Because pretty much by the sounds of it, they blew his head off. Buck Barrow, pretty much didn't really, stand a chance, at that particular time. And I don't think Blanche, really had it in her to, keep going. Five days later, on the 24th of July, the Barrow gang, camped at Dexfield Park, which was an abandoned amusement park at Dexter, Iowa. And, he also had a head wound as well, but unlike Buck, it was only superficial. And they pretty much went to, nurse their wounds, pretty much. And I think once again they also got shot at again, and they, ran on foot to get out of there. And also I got a funny feeling at this particular time, Bonnie Parker was also shot. I think she was shot in the stomach. And, they pretty much, went back on the run. Stealing cars, going from state to state. They went from, they operated between West Colorado to North Minnesota. And then back to southeast Mississippi. And, they're trying to stay low and only committing, small crimes. In early September, they risked a run to Dallas to see their families for the first time in 4 months. Jones, parted company, and he, parted company with them. And, continued to Houston, where his mother had moved. And he was arrested there without any incident on the 16th of November. And he was returned to Dallas. For a little while, Clyde Barrow would commit, small-time crimes. On the 22nd of November, 1933, they narrowly evaded the arrest while trying to meet with family members in Soas, Texas. And, they went in for a trap. However, they were able to escape once again. They were able to, outfight them. On November 28th, The grand jury, delivered murder indictment for, against Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow on for the January 1933 killing of Tarrant County Deputy Malcolm Davis. It was the first warrant for murder for Bonnie Parker. And also that one, I got a funny thing that they said it was her, but it was a secret deal, from the police with one of the family members of the Barrow gang to get someone to get to get their criminal record, wiped clean. So they pretty much, sold Bonnie Parker down the river, if you know what I mean. On January 16th, 1934, Clyde Barrow orchestrated the escape of Raymond Hamilton, Henry Melvin, and several others in the infamous Eltham breakout in 1934. This one out of all the crimes committed by the Barrow gang, and in particular of Clyde Barrow, this one was his ultimate goal. He wanted this. He believed that this was his revenge. His revenge on the state. Revenge on that. But he didn't want to get these people out. He wanted to free as many criminals as possible from Eastham, prison farm. And, some of these, I think some of them, decided to stay with the Barrow gang, and some of them, went on their own way, because they were only able to get, a couple of, prisoners. And during the escape, one of the prison officers, Major Joe Crossan, was fatally shot and later died in hospital. And this was pretty much all what I think J. Edgar Hoover had to do to inspire getting the FBI to, get the inspiration to get the FBI created. Or the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and pretty much this was the time the Federal Bureau of Investigations was born. And as a result of this, of course, a big manhunt. From February 10, Hammer became the constant shadow of Clyde Barrow and, Bonnie Parker. And at this particular time, they were living out of their car, and going from town to town, being bandits. Three of Hammer's four brothers were also Texas Rangers. So if this was the person I was telling you about beforehand, they were trying to get someone to get a clean bill of health. Or not bill of health, to clean their record. On April 1st, 1934, Easter Sunday, Clyde Barrow and Henry Melvin killed two young highwaymen patrolling, highway patrolman H.D. Murphy and Edward Bryant Wheeler, at the intersection of Route 114 and Dove Road near Grapeville, Texas, which is now known as South Lake. And, this is where things get a little bit murky. Because the eyewitness said they saw Bonnie Parker, doing the fatal shot. But there's been a lot of arguments whether it was true or not. In the spring of 1934, Grapeville killings were recounted in exaggerating the detail, affecting public perception for all the Dallas daily papers, and told by eyewitnesses. A farmer who claimed to have seen Bonnie Parker, laughed at the patrolman Murphy's head. Laughed and said that the patrolman's, Murphy's head bounced like a rubber ball. right after she shot. But once again, these, they were trying to sell papers, so we can't really, say for sure if that's exactly, what had happened. But as a result, there was a big outcry, and a lot of people, wanted the Barrow Gang. $1,000 reward went on their heads. Another $500, which was, added to that as well, And this was specifically for Bonnie Parker. All up, it was about $1,500. On the 23rd of May, 1934, on a rural road in Bainville Parish, Louisiana, the couple had appeared in daylight in their automobile and were shot by the posing for Texas officers and 2 Louisiana officers. The pose has led Hammer, who had the gun tracking, who began tracking the pair, because Hammer, he was tracking these gang from state to state to state. He was pretty much, like a bulldog, and he tracked them down, on February 12, 1934. That's when he found them, and he began to find out where they were. He was doing what the FBI does today. You could say, in some ways, you could say he was the first FBI agent. They learned where they were on the 21st of May, 1934, and they knew that they were in Shreveport. And the full pose consisted of Captain Hammer, Dallas County Sheriff Deputy Alcorn, and Ted Hinton. And these people all knew Bonnie Parker when she was a waitress. Former Texas Ranger B.M. Manny Galt, Bainville Parish Sheriff Henderson Jordan, and his deputy Prentice Oakley set up an ambush at the rendezvous point along Louisiana State Highway 154 south of Gibbsland towards Hales. Hinton, recounted that the group was in place by 9 p.m. On the 21st of May, and they were staying there, all night. At approximately 9:15 a.m. on the 23rd of May, the pose were concealed behind the bushes and almost ready, to concede defeat, heard Barrow's stolen Ford V8, because they were thought that they weren't coming. The pose's, officer reported that had Barrow stopped to speak. The pose's official report had stated that, Clyde Barrow had stopped to speak with Melvin's father, who had been planted there with a truck that morning to distract Clyde Barrow and forced him into the lane, lane closer to the posse. The lawman opened fire, killing Clyde Barrow and Bonnie Parker, while shooting a combined total of 130 rounds. So Clyde Barrow and Bonnie Parker were killed instantly, even though Bonnie Parker was heard screaming. And researchers have said that Bonnie and Clyde were shot more than 50 times each. Others claim that they were shot. Others claim to 25 rounds per corpse, or 50 total. So it's, hit or miss. I'm not quite sure how many times they were shot. And the coroner, of the Parker gang of Clyde Barrow and Bonnie Parker had stated nearly everyone had begun collecting souvenirs such as shell casings, slivers of glass from the shattered car windows, and bloody pieces of clothing from the garments of Bonnie and Clyde. One eager man had opened his pocket knife and was reaching into the car to cut off Clyde's left ear, which is kind of very gruesome, but this is nothing new. People usually did this. But one thing I find very interesting that is actually the coroner who states this, not the police. and it was a circus. Blanche got sentenced to jail. She went to jail right after her husband had perished. And 20 members of the family of Bonnie and Clyde were arrested, for aiding and abetting, Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow. And all 20 of them either pleaded or were found guilty. The two mothers were jailed for 30 days. Others sentenced range from 2 years imprisonment for Raymond Hamilton's brother Floyd to 1 hour in custody for Marie Barrow, Clyde's teenage sister. Other defendants, including Blanche Barrow, W.D. Jones, Henry Mifflin, and Bonnie's sister Billy. I think they all had, prison sentence. Blanche Barrow was left permanently blind in her left eye. She was taken into custody on the charge of assault with the intent to kill. She was convicted and sentenced to 10 years in prison, but was paroled in 1939 for good behaviour. She returned to Dallas, leaving her life of crime in the past, and lived there with her family. Lived there with her invalid father as his caregiver. In 1940, she married Eddie Fruser, worked as a taxi cab dispatcher and a beautician, and completed the terms of her parole 1 year later. She lived in peace with her husband until he died of cancer in 1969, and I think she also died of cancer as well, and I think she died in the 1980s. Warren Beatty approached her purchase rights to her name of use in 1967 for the film Bonnie and Clyde. While she agreed for the original script, she objected to the characterization in the film, describing the film as a screaming horse ass. Blanche Parker, died at the age of 77 on the 24th of December 1988, so I was right, she died in the 80s. Raymond Hamilton and Joe Palmer, both SM escapees, in January 1934, were convicted of the murder. Both were executed in the electric chair at Huntsville, Texas, on 10th of May 1935. W.D. Jones had split from his mentors. He split from, the Barrow gang after the three evaded officers at Dexville Park in July 1933. He reached Houston, got a job picking cotton, where he was soon discovered and captured. He confessed to the crimes and claimed that he had been kept prisoner by Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow. Henry Melvin, and another protege of, the Barrow gang, or another member of the Barrow gang, was convicted in Oklahoma in 1934 for the murder of Constable Campbell at Commerce. He was paroled in 1942, and he was killed by a train in 1948. Because apparently he had a drinking problem. They do not know whether he fell asleep on the tracks or whether somebody deliberately put him on the tracks. We do not know. We don't know if it was an accident or death, a murder. We do not know. We don't even know if it's suicide. His father, Ivy, had been killed in 1946 by hit and run. Bonnie Parker's husband, Roy Thornton, was sentenced to 5 years in prison for burglary in 1933. He was killed by guards on October 3rd, 1937, during an escape attempt from Eastham Farm Prison. So this was the same prison which Clyde Barrow was in. So yeah, this is the Barrow Gang. And the thing what I find very interesting, with the Barrow Gang, what I've read in other books, is that they're not quite sure whether Clyde Barrow and Bonnie Parker, yes, they were in love, but there is absolutely no evidence, none, from anyone that they were sexually active. There is no proof. And I don't think they ever were, they've never, had sexual intercourse. And I believe that the reason for that was because Clyde Barrow was a homosexual, that he was actually gay. And back in the 1930s, it was not good to be a homosexual. It was, I think it was considered a crime back then, and also it was considered a mental illness. So yeah, this is how the FBI was created. Hopefully you enjoyed the special on Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow and the Barrow Gang. If you like this video, please like and subscribe. Have a great day and blessed be.